Hey, welcome to another Mob Rules Danny's Hot Takes. Today we're going to be reviewing the new 9th edition Warhammer 40k rules, and we're going to be going section by section through the rulebook. So this is the very first of the series. So we'll be detailing the way that the game works now. We're going to be keying this more towards people who want a comprehensive review of the rules and not just changes of things that have changed. So so right now, the very first one we're going to go over is the basic rules, and the basic rules kind of sets the frame and the tone for the entire rules in the rulebook. It kind of lays out some basic concepts that you'll need to understand in order to play a game of Warhammer 40,000. So the very first section of the basic rules kind of details what various things in the game mean. So when we talk about missions, when we talk about armies, keywords, data sheets, what engagement range is, for instance, how to read a data sheet, and then like how to go through various parts of the rules. So first section we're going to go. So the very first part of this, we're going to go look at missions. So missions, you have to play a mission in order to play a game of Warhammer 40,000. And so when they reference mission, they mean the comprehensive rules for missions. And we'll be going over a section on missions later on for matched play. And so we'll be going over that quite more in depth, and that you can find that on page 236. By the way, the rules in this are pretty comprehensive. There's about 170 pages of rules that detail your basic rules, how to play the games, going through the different phases, as well as missions, the crusade rules, and there's also a rules index in the back of the book that you can check out. So, when they talk about your army, they're referring to the collection of models that you bring to the table. So whatever you set as your army, whether you're playing open play and you kind of just bring whatever you want, whether you're playing match play with power level or points, or you're playing your narrative play, which is also power level, and that's the crusade rules, and we'll go over those as we go through. Each model in your army will have a data sheet. And the data sheet details what the unit can do. So how it interacts with the battlefield, how far it can move, how well it fights, how well it shoots, various different other aspects. And we'll be going a little bit more in depth on that. As well, you have your keywords. Keywords are extremely important for creating your army. And they also reference many different special rules as well. So you have faction keywords, and then you also have other keywords that are specific to the unit that could tie into rules, or it might be referenced by other models as well. And when we talk about units, we talk about a group of models in the game. When you use a unit in the game, that's a collection of models. So the data sheet will go over a particular unit of models, and your army will consist of multiple units of models. Then we go about coherence. Then we talk about unit coherency. So unit coherency is how your models have to be set up on the table, like how close they have to be together. And for a unit to be in coherency, every single model has to be within 2 inches of another model's base or hull, and 5 inches of vertical coherency. So if you have a guy up on one level of a ruin or something like that, or a piece of terrain, you can be further than 2 inches from that model's base as long as you're within 2 inches horizontally and 5 inches vertically. So you don't have to measure at like a diagonal angle or anything like that in order to figure out if your unit's in coherency range, which is pretty nice. So if you have a unit that's 5 or less models, every model has to be within coherency of one other model in its own unit. Well, if a unit has 6 or more models, each model has to be in coherency with 2 or more other models from its own unit. Keep in mind that unit coherency doesn't really affect models that are single models, so they don't have to be in coherency with anybody else, because you know what, they're their own person and they don't have to rely on anybody else. A really important rule in this game is engagement range. So engagement range is kind of representation of like swinging in close combat for different units. So you can't be close to you can't be close to an enemy unit. You have to stay at least 1 inch horizontal and 5 inches vertically from another enemy model. So your models can't get too close to the enemy models unless they're in combat. And so when we go over the charge section, we'll go about moving models into engagement range. There's a couple of other ways that you can get into engagement range as well, but engagement range affects many different things, whether or not models can shoot or not, as well as a couple of other different rules, which are very important. The next big section that we talk about is the battlefield. So the battlefield is where you're going to play your game. It's where the mission is set. It's what the armies are fighting over. And so the battlefield contains usually a flat surface, although it can be elevated to different elevations. And that will have various different pieces of terrain on it. And those terrain features will have their own special rules on how your army interacts with them. Games Workshop recommends that every single battlefield roughly has about one piece of terrain on it for every 12-inch by 12-inch square on the table. So on your typically sized game of 2,000 points or 200 power level, you're going to have about, I think it was, let's see, so it's 5 feet, so 50 inches by 44 inches, so roughly 5 by 4. So you're going to have about 20 pieces of terrain per table, maybe like 18 is probably good. So when you're interacting with various different things in the game, you have to measure distance. This is extremely important in 40K. You have to measure distance between models, as well as objective markers, which become incredibly important in order for you to complete the mission that you're trying to play. And so when you're measuring distances in 40K, you always measure base to base. You can measure whenever you'd like. If a model doesn't have a base, you can measure to its hull. And there are instances where you can only interact with like the closest enemy unit or the closest enemy model or the closest model or things like that. And so if you have several units that are the closest model and they're all the same range exactly, which is pretty rare, but you can set it up that way for sure, especially with the ability to pre-measure, you can choose which of those units is the closest. Many different rules in 40K refer to models within or wholly within, and this can be things like auras for characters or terrain features or within range of objectives and things like that. And so there's a difference between within and wholly within. And so if a model is within range, just a part of its base or the hull have to be within range, whereas wholly within requires that the entire model has to be within that range. And then you can have unit within and units wholly within. If a unit is within range, then it just has to be one model from the unit, whereas a unit wholly within range has to have every single model from the unit within range. One thing about measuring distances or moving models around the table, and we'll go over that during the movement phase review, is you have the wobbly models kind of like tip. And so when you have a model that can't quite fit where it's supposed to be without like falling over, you don't want to have your model fall off some high precipice and break on the ground or on the table if the table gets jarred or moved or something like that. So you can just say your model is sitting up there and then set it down below in a safe place, in its own safe space, so it can't be injured by some clumsy pedestrian knocking all 3 of your repulsor tanks onto the table from the top of a run. All right. And so when you want to interact with things, in order to show success or failure in an action that you're trying to do, and not specifically an action, capital A, but just when you're trying to do stuff on the table, you have to roll dice. So these are referred to throughout the rules as a D6. Sometimes you have to roll 2D6 or 3D6, that kind of stuff. Just roll however many dice it says. So if it's 2D6, it's 2 dice, 3D6 is 3 dice, and add the results together. Whereas if the game asks you to roll a D3, which the D3 does exist, you can get a dice that has 3 sides. It's usually a 6-sided dice with each value printed twice. You can roll a D6 and have the result and then round it up. And so that is indicative of a D3. There are also values that you'll have to roll to meet. So like in order to hit somebody, you would have to roll a ballistic skill check. And so that requires you to roll, if your model's ballistic skill is 3 or 3+, that means you just have to roll a 3 or better on a dice. Keep in mind, that you apply dice modifiers in the following order. You divide a dice and then multiply dice, whatever the result is, I should say. You divide, then multiply, then add, and then subtract. And so just something to keep in mind when you are having to modify dice rolls. And a dice cannot be modified to a value of less than 1, but it can be modified to a value of more than 6. So that's also important. All right. So then we have the re-rolls. So some abilities and models will let you re-roll dice. There's also some stratagems and things like that. It'll let you re-roll dice. Now, you can't re-roll a re-rolled dice, so you can't roll a dice more than once. Or you can't re-roll a dice more than once, I should say. And keep in mind that re-rolls are applied before modifiers, if there are any modifiers. So if a unit gives you a -1 to hit and your unit can re-roll 1s, it doesn't mean you get to re-roll 1s and 2s. It just means you get to re-roll 1s. So just keep that in mind as well. And they're also unmodified dice rolls, which means you check to see if those abilities kind of happen before you check whether before you re-roll. I'm sorry, no, after you reroll. My apologies. So you check those after that, but before you apply any modifiers to that dice. So if you get like an extra hit, if you roll a natural 6 or an unmodified 6, that'll happen before you get a -1 to hit or something like that. So important to remember too, because there's a lot of abilities that modify dice rolls. So it's really important when you're rolling dice to keep your opponent in mind. And so you're playing 40K with somebody else. It's a game. You're both having a really good time, of course, because, 40K is a great game. One thing you want to remember is you want your opponent to be able to see your dice rolls. You don't want to have any kind of sketchy, oh yeah, I rolled this 6. It went behind this building. You can't see it. So either you wait for your opponent to come look at it, or you can, that's the best. Or even better than that is just to roll the dice where everybody can see them, and pick up any dice that fail and let your opponent see the dice that succeed. And if you miss one, that happens to me all the time. Your opponent can let you know that, hey, you need to roll that dice, or that dice is a failure. This is also really important if a dice doesn't land flat. Beautiful 40K terrain is not always flat to the table, and so sometimes the dice will get cocked, which means that it's off its center. Typically speaking, I always recommend that if a dice isn't totally flat, you just re-roll the dice. But different places have different rules. Some people say, like if a dice gets stacked on top of it and it doesn't fall off, then it's not cocked. That's fine, whatever. As long as you and your opponent agree to the same thing, that's really important. So just make sure that you agree to that before the game starts. That just makes things a lot easier. Then you have situations where you might have to roll off with your opponent. This happens when you are betting money. Or if you are trying to roll to see who goes, thank you. When you're trying to roll to see who goes first. If this happens, you both roll a dice. If there's a tie, you re-roll it. The person who rolls the highest wins. And then there are also a bunch of sequencing things. So if several rules have to be resolved at the same time, the player whose turn it is chooses the order in which the rules are resolved. So this becomes extremely important in a couple of scenarios. So just make sure to remember that. We also have a little blurb about starting strength, half strength, and destroyed units. So a unit starting strength is the number of models that it starts with on the table at the start of the game. That is the starting strength of the unit. That's where you base half strength on. So if a unit goes to half strength, that means it goes below. Is less than half of its starting strength. So it has to go below. It doesn't have to be equal. That's below half strength. There are certain rules that apply there, mostly morale. And then there's also, if the last model in a unit is destroyed, either through morale or they get killed, that unit is destroyed. All right. Next up, we have data sheets. So data sheets is how you understand what your models can do. These are, again, super important. So you're going to want to study your data sheets well to know exactly what your models can do. Or you can just forget about the cool abilities your models have and then lose. That happens to me all the time. That's right, guys. That's right. So a basic rundown of what a data sheet is in this section. So you have what the unit's name is, what its battlefield role is. So you can check that out on page 244, or when we go over how to build your army later on. It also has the profile. So the NO, no means no, but it also means the number of units or the number of models in the unit. And then it also tells you what the minimum and maximum size of the unit is. So that's also in this section, which is important. Then you have its weapon skill, how good it is at fighting, ballistic skill, how good it is at shooting, strength. I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory. Toughness is how hard they are to kill. Wounds is how many times they can sustain injuries before dying. Attacks is how fast they are, how many swings they get to make in combat. Leadership is how disciplined and courageous the models are. And then the save details kind of how tough their armor is, or how resilient potentially they are. That's another one that can kind of fluctuate between that and toughness. Then you have your composition and war gear section. So this details what the model is equipped with. And then you can reference the weapons chart to see what those things do. And then you have, there's a rule here called understrength units. So if you don't have enough units to fill the minimum sized unit, you can still include them. But just be aware that they will cost the same amount of points as the minimum size unit. So you want to try and get at least a minimum size unit to really get the best bang for your buck. Then you have their abilities. So these are the cool rules that your unit gets to do that differentiates them from other units in Warhammer. So this will detail kind of like if they get a bonus when they charge because they're really good at assaulting and fighting, or if they are really resilient and they get an extra cool ability that gives them an invulnerable save, which we'll go over later. It'll be detailed here. They also have what are called aura abilities, and so these will say this ability, blah blah blah. It's called this, and then it'll have in parentheses aura afterwards, and this just kind of means that anything within that range, that radius of that model, will get a new ability or have an extra benefit. And then we have weapons that'll go over what the range is, how far it can shoot. If it's melee, that means it's hand-to-hand combat. If it has a minimum range, that means you can't shoot weapons that are within that shortest range. The type, and we'll go over that in the shooting and fight phases. The strength, if the strength is user, then it uses the model strength. If it has like a modifier to a statistic to the strength, then that means it's that model statistic plus or times or minus whatever that value is. And armor penetration is how good it is at getting through their armor, and the damage is how many wounds they take if somebody fails a save from that weapon. And then if there's any special abilities, they'll go over that. Then there's a section that goes over what their war gear options are. So if they have any options for taking additional weapons or things like that, they'll go over that. And then importantly, keywords. So keywords kind of detail how this unit fits into your army. Just like we talked about a little bit earlier, this will kind of help you to build your army. And then they have damage tables. So damage tables are typically for larger models with lots of wounds. So as they take wounds, the model will get weaker, and you'll have reduced abilities. Usually, some models get stronger when they get wounded because they get mad. We also have modifying characteristics. So this is very similar to modifying dice rolls. So all characteristic modifiers are cumulative. Apply modifiers in the same order. So division, multiplication, addition, and then subtraction. Round fractions up, which is great. And then strength, toughness, attacks, and leadership can never be modified below 1. They have a minimum value of 1, which is great. That means your guys can't just fall into the black pit of strength 0 or something. If they have a random move characteristic, you roll for the whole unit at once, and then they get to move that far. Let's see here. And then other random characteristics are determined individually when it's required. So like if they have random attacks, when they go to attack, you roll and see how many attacks they get. And that's individual for individual models. So if you have 6 models with D6 attacks, you roll 6d6, and they get that many attacks. And then a characteristic of dash can never be modified. All right. And so that goes over the basic rules, and you have to understand those before we can get into how to actually play the game. So those are kind of some baseline information. That's kind of some baseline information. All right. So that's the review of the basic rules. And stay tuned. Check out our next series where we'll be going over the command phase and the movement phase and the shooting phase and the psychic phase and the charge phase and fight phase and morale phase. So we'll see you for those.